A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Schabbos hat es getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
Big Gabra with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to be our fourth and final episode in our ongoing series, the last installment of our series about the secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era. So if you've been liking this series and this podcast, you can help out the podcast by telling your friends and family about it. If they're one of the rare people who don't already listen to Jewish History Soundbites, you can also help out the podcast by leaving a rating or review on whichever platform you listen to it, which is helps it in more ways than you can imagine. If we want to summarize the first three parts of our series on the secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era, we talked about the true causes of secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era as being external, as being related more to political and economic and other changes like that, wars, revolutions, immigration, technology, and stuff like that. And we discussed the Orthodox response. Orthodoxy is a modern movement as a defense mechanism against the challenges of the modern era, and less so, and also about the mechanisms of secularization, how secularization actually took place, and how secularization is very little, if any, related to the internal Jewish movements that it is usually attributed to, such as Reform or Haskala. That's what we discussed. Until now, we've been getting tons of feedback with different angles and points. Some very valid points have been mentioned and discussed. I want to focus on one particular feedback I got just because it was so funny, and it's one of my favorite of all time. I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, I think it was on the second installment of this series, about Orthodoxy as a modern movement. And I mentioned I gave a illustration, a bit of storytelling. It was in honor of the upcoming Purim at the time, about how here in Ramat Beit Shemesh, several years ago, I don't know, about 10 years ago or so, there was a tzedakah campaign by the local Kupa Shel Tzedakah, the local tzedakah organization here in the neighborhood, about Starbucks, and about how rabbis were against it because they thought it was actually a Starbucks opening. And I use that how to illustrate Orthodoxy in the modern era, is that we define ourselves by our red lines, by our defense mechanisms, by what we're against. And the joke was on me, because apparently there are several listeners in our audience who are affiliated with the Ramat Beit Shemesh Tzedakah organization, and they informed me, they had a good laugh about it, and it's good because it was close to Purim, so it was good to get a laugh about it, that they planted that opposition. The opposition, the supposed rabbinical opposition to their campaign, was created by the Tzedakah organization as part of a Purim gag to create more publicity for the Tzedakah campaign. There was no rabbinical opposition to the Starbucks thing. It was all part of the Purim fun by the Tzedakah organization themselves, which, of course, generated more publicity. So that the joke is on me. That was really funny. I actually like that. I appreciate that. But having said that, I think it still proves the point I was trying to make, perhaps even more so than before. The fact that they knew, the ones running the campaign, the Tzedakah campaign, knew that the way to generate publicity would be to create a fake a rabbinical opposition to Starbucks, would be a most natural response. I think kind of proves my point about orthodoxy in the modern era. Let's go on to the goals of today's episode, the final installment of this series about the secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era. So what we have so far is a rather structured historical argument that we've observed a trend towards secularization over the past 3 centuries or so, because it's really more than 3 centuries. We discussed that in last episode. And we are, in the context of this series, seeking the cause of this trend. It had been supposed, before this series was publicized on Jewish History Soundbites, that the internal Jewish movements, such as Haskala and Reform, were to be blamed for this surge in secularization in the modern era. And on this series, we pretty much conclusively proved that it was in fact external factors which were largely inevitable. They're part of those great wheels of history that are inevitable to the modern era. Political changes, economic changes, technological advancements, wars, revolutions, urbanization, the Industrial Revolution, immigration, legislation by governments, and of course the big one is emancipation, giving Jews equal rights. And in the framework of that emancipation, I think it's worth mentioning and emphasizing also something that I've mentioned earlier on this series, that in the process of emancipation, the governments of Europe ended the autonomous kahila structure and the control that the kahal had over the individual Jew, which was a distinctive feature of the pre-modern era. All that is the real causes of the secularization. We also discussed how orthodoxy was born in the modern era and ironically strengthened through this struggle with the modern era, through the struggle with these other internal Jewish movements such as Reform and Haskala, and therefore how we're viewing orthodoxy as a modern movement. And of course the mechanisms of secularization. So in this episode, this final episode, I'd like to flip the entire discussion on its head. The supposed villain for secularization, the internal Jewish movements, Haskala and Reform, which we proved were not the causes of secularization. So if they were not engines of secularization, then what were they? What are these internal Jewish movements of the modern era? What are these non-orthodox Jewish movements in the modern era if they were not engines for secularization? So this episode will examine the true historic role of these various internal non-orthodox movements of the past few centuries and examine their accomplishments and relationship with secularization and assimilation and with orthodoxy, conversely, on the other end of the spectrum. First of all, which movements are we talking about? So let's list a few of the more prominent ones, and we'll provide a brief description of when, where, and to what scope. How long did they last? There's the German Haskala. German Haskala is a very short-lived movement of the last decades of the 18th century. It's a German Jewish Enlightenment movement. This is pre-Reform. This is the Hama'asef in Königsberg and maybe Moses Mendelssohn's Circle in Berlin and others. This is a German Jewish Enlightenment which lasted a couple of decades before it kind of petered out. By the 1790s, it was pretty much done for. So you're talking about I don't know if it deserves to be called a movement. It was a grouping in a couple of German cities that lasted about 20-something years or so. And was its goals were to have Jews integrate more into their surrounding societies and have more knowledge of general knowledge. We do see a connection from the German short-lived Haskala to the Galician Haskala. The Haskala kind of migrated from those northern German cities that I mentioned, Königsberg and Berlin, south to Vienna and Prague. And through Vienna and Prague, it reached Galicia, Austrian at that time, later Austro-Hungarian Galicia, the Habsburg Empire, where Haskala did flourish during the early decades of the 19th century. This is the famous Galician maskilim such as Yosef Perel and Nachman Krochmal, even Mendel Laffin, who was first in Poland, he was even earlier in Berlin, and he himself ends up in Galicia. Or you have Rappaport, what's his name again? Shir, yeah. Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, and many others. The Galician Haskala, also nominally religious. This is not a reform movement. This is not a secularization movement, but with new ideas and incorporating outside wisdom and coming closer to integrate to the surrounding society in the modern era. Of course, the Galician Haskala also migrates into the Tsarist Russian Empire, and you have the Russian Haskala. The Russian Jewish Haskala is, we'll call it, from the 1820s to the 1880s. By the 1880s, the Haskala in Russia has run its course. I did a couple of episodes in the past on this podcast about the Russian Haskala. You can check those out. So it does last for about 60 years. I would, again, never deem to call it a movement. It never becomes a mass movement. It's it produces some writing, some literature. It has, again, very little influence on the wider Russian Jewish society. Definitely not related to secularization in any way. That's another movement. So those are Haskala movements. Then there's reform. There's German reform, which appears in the early 1800s. And it lasts, I guess we can say, till the Holocaust, so over 100 years, but it diminishes influence over the 19th century as German Jewry becomes more and more secular and assimilated. So German reform does have an impact, but not so much of a wider impact, because German Jewish society is much more trending towards secularization and assimilation than reform. You also have American reform, which incredibly arises independent of German reform in the United States on its own in the 1820s. And eventually it's influenced by German reform because there's the German Jewish migration from the 1820s to the 1860s, till the Civil War, we'll say. There's a massive German Jewish immigration, so they bring German reform with them. So there's this marriage between German and American reform. American reform, in theory, is influential until today. In theory, whether it's actually influential and has been, it will perhaps say for another time as a reform movement, because American Jewry is much more defined by its secularization, assimilation, and intermarriage than by anything reform could offer. Perhaps we could say American reform was unsuccessful at stopping assimilation and intermarriage. That's definitely a true historical statement. But to say that it had a major impact on American Jewish life, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. But again, we'll save that discussion for another time. There is a very influential reform movement, and that's Hungarian reform. And they're not called reform, they're called neolog, which we've discussed in the past. I think it actually deserves its own episode one day when we talk about the split between neolog and orthodox, the Teilung in Hungarian Jewry. I also have mentioned that in the past, but I think it could be explored more in depth, the legacy of the Chassam Sofer and his Talmidim to split orthodoxy off of the mainstream Jewish community in 1868. Neolog was very dominant in Hungarian Jewish life until the Holocaust. But what I like pointing out about Neolog is that Neolog was a minority too. There was a minority of religious Jews in Hungary in the 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries. The majority were secular and assimilated. A minority were religious. Now, there's two types of religious. There was Reform religious, which was called Neolog in Hungary. They were the majority of religious Jews. And then there was a minority within the minority, and that was Orthodox Hungarian Jews. And Neolog, as influential as it was, and as large as it was, and as dominant as it was itself was in the minority of the much larger secularist assimilationist trend in Hungarian Jewry. There were other smaller movements. There was the Science of Judaism, which is known by its German name, which I can't even pronounce, Wissenschaft des Judentis, whatever it's called, the science of Judaism. I'll stick with the English translation. So that was a movement to create the history to examine Judaism scientifically, and Bible studies and Jewish history, all examined through a scientific lens. It was an intellectual movement that was full of heresy from an Orthodox point of view, and apikoursis, but I don't think it actually had much of an influence. There was the Breslau Seminary, an historical Judaism of Zechariah Frankel and Heinrich Gretz, famous historian. It's sometimes called the father of American conservative Judaism. I'm not convinced of the direct link between the two, maybe an ideological link between the two. I'm not sure if there's a linear historical link between the two. The Breslau Seminary and historical Judaism had very minimal impact on Jewish life. Again, a lot of polemics. Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch and many others fought with the historical notions that were coming out of Gretz's books and Beis Medrash, and the masses, on the Jewish masses, I'm not sure if the Jewish masses were attracted to the Breslau Seminary. You did have the radical Haskala in Russia, which did actually try to change halacha. I guess that's the closest thing we could call reform in Russia. There was this short period in the 1870s where there was radical Haskala, which tried to do away with certain elements of halacha. Not sure how successful they were. Secularization was already catching on. Then there's the much more influential movements at the time, which came a generation later. A generation later, you have the rise in the 1880s and on, we'll say, from the 1880s until the war, until after the war, until today, really, Jewish nationalism. Jewish nationalism in its many forms arises in the 1880s, primarily in Tsarist Russia, but in other countries as well, across Europe. Now, Jewish nationalism takes many forms. We'll talk about the lesser influential and the lesser known forms first. Autonomism. Jewish autonomism. Famous historian Shimon Dubnov was the biggest proponent of this philosophy and ideology and later politics as well. That Jews are a nation that have a certain autonomy within their home nation. In other words, they're loyal Russians, they're loyal to the Tsar or whoever the government is in whatever country they live in. But they are their own people with their own history, their own culture, their own norms, their own language, their Yiddish, right? Their own, they have autonomy. A certain, state within a state with loyalty to their state at the national level, but Jews are their own nation and they have their own autonomy. Now, this is a secular ideology. In other words, now we're all talking about Jews who are already secular. But the idea is that Jews can be secular, but they don't have to assimilate and intermarry and then have a negation of their Jewish identity. You can still remain Jewish and a proud Jew and Jewish identity as a Jewish nationalist with your own autonomy and your own communal infrastructure. As a secular Jew with your own social services and your own language and your own culture and your own writings and your own history, especially history. They were big on that. So that's one type of Jewish nationalism, and that's definitely a secular movement, but they're not taking religious Jews and making them secular. They're taking secular Jews and saying, hey, secular Jews, you don't have to assimilate and intermarry. You can remain Jewish with a strong Jewish identity and still be secular, right? So it goes in the other direction. Another Jewish nationalism was Jewish, it was interesting nationalism, like the Bundists, the socialist, which socialism is not nationalist, but here you have I don't want to say National Socialism because that means something else entirely. We're talking about the Bund did embrace this socialism on one hand as an economic system, but as a national identity, they embrace nationalism. Specifically the Yiddish language, marrying Yiddish culture and Yiddish language to socialism. That was the Bundist view and other similar political movements' view of Jewish nationalism. Perhaps the most famous and influential Jewish nationalism, which lasts until today, in the form of the State of Israel is Zionism. The idea first starts in Russia as the Chibas Tzion movement, the lovers of Zion. That's the beginnings of Jewish nationalism in the form of Zionism. The Jews are a nation, and therefore, again, we're talking about secular Jews who already went through the process of secularization, but they have this strong Jewish identity. They don't want to assimilate into Russian culture, to integrate into Russian and intermarry, and that's it, just integrate into surrounding society in the modern era. They say, no, Jews are a nation. We should have our own country and our own society, and therefore there's a strong Jewish identity, and Jews shouldn't assimilate. That's the Zionism. Then it becomes, 2 decades later, secular Zionism, the Zionist movement, and that's the form of Jewish nationalism. So then, of course, you bring these movements to the interwar period, post-World War I. It forms many of these movements that I described become very politicized. Then you come to post-war, and post-war there's the American conservative movement, conservative Judaism, which is, it starts pre-war, but it comes to its heyday in the post-war. So that's another movement worth mentioning in this context. And of course, the State of Israel, which is the concrete form of the Zionist movement, comes into the State of Israel in 1948, and that basically the State of Israel is saying you can be a secular Jew in the modern world, but you don't have to assimilate and intermarry. You can have a strong Jewish identity, a Jewish country, and a Jewish army, and a Jewish language, and Jewish culture, and Jewish everything else. And therefore, there's not going to be a complete negation of Jewish identity with assimilation and intermarriage. So there's all the smaller ones. I probably left out a few also. So that's the movements we're talking about if we go from the 1700s until the modern day. Now, which movements, and I'm putting the word movements in this question in quotation marks, which movements are we not including? We're not including in this list the secularization movement, the assimilationism movement, the immigration movement. Why not? Because those movements are not an organized Jewish movement maintaining Jewish identity in the modern era in a secular or watered-down religious form. They are movements that negate Jewish identity. Immigration not explicitly, but inherently it did to many, not to all, who immigrated. But immigration, again, was not an organized ideological movement. It was a natural masses movement. So inherently, all the movements that I discussed on this, that I mentioned on this list, by their very existence and nature, was trying to preserve some sort of, in many instances, secular, in many instances religious, just another form of religious, not orthodox, Jewish identity in the modern era. In other words, all these movements, what they stood for was the opposite of assimilation or even total secularization. Because total secularization or assimilation would be complete integration, acculturation, assimilation into the surrounding society in the modern era, and ultimately a complete negation of Jewish identity through intermarriage. This was viewed by many as the ultimate goal of emancipation. In other words, pre-modern era, the Jewish people was not allowed to integrate into society. Emancipation made Jews equal, so therefore we could. And therefore, ultimately, there will be no longer any Jewish identity. These movements, on the long list that I mentioned, every single one of them without exception, impeded that progression towards total assimilation, which had been set in place by emancipation in the modern era, by their very existence. Their very existence of all these movements was preserving a form of Jewish identity. By their very essence, they were anti-assimilationist movements. So what were they? For the most part, they were quite unsuccessful. That's what they were, with a few exceptions on that list. The State of Israel has been pretty successful, but not too many others on that list were very successful. Most of them didn't last very long. Some of them lasted only a few years. Haskala lasted only a few years in most places. The most of these movements that I listed had very little impact on the wider Jewish world. Again, the State of Israel is an exception. Zionism is an exception. But most of those other ones had very little impact on the wider Jewish world, were small and short blips on the screen of Jewish history. They did not have many adherents. They were not mass movements. They were at best short-lived. So, to give them such credence and such, the religious world gives them so much credit and makes them into these huge, impactful movements on Jewish history. I think that's giving them way too much credit than they deserve. One of my favorite illustrations of this is from the Russian Jewish Haskala movement. And it's one of the most important maskilim, named Yehuda Leib Gordon, Yalag, as he was known. He was a Hebrew poet, and influential educator and other things. And not that influential, like I said, because Haskala did not have that much influence. But there's a very famous poem of his that he wrote, Lemi ani amel. Who am I toiling for? Who am I writing for? And he wrote this towards the end of his life, and this really encapsulates this point that I'm making. In other words, he himself in real time recognized the point that I am making here on this podcast right now. He says, who in the world am I writing for? Lemi ani amel mivchar kol shanai. I'm dedicating all my years to write. Who am I doing this for? And then he goes through it. He says, Horai, my parents, in other words, the older generation, Hadvekim belokim uba'amam, who are devoted, who are connected to God and to their people, Oskim b'schora ub'mitzvot kol yomam, who are busy with commerce, with their jobs, and with mitzvahs. In other words, the religious Jews. And then, because he was so derogatory about religious life, he writes the next line. He says, those people, I'm not writing for them, Ma'asu hada'at. They are against knowledge. They're against Haskala, in other words, right? He says, I can't be, he says, these people, the religious Jews, they say, Mavet Bashir Epikursus Bamalitza. They call what I'm doing Epikursus, heresy. So he says, I can't be writing for them. So he says, to whom am I writing for? Achai hamaskilim? Am I writing for my brothers who are the maskilim? He says, and I'm not writing for them either. You know why? Izvua, abandon our language, in other words, the Hebrew language. Ki ish lisfat artso nelech, because everyone should integrate into the language of their country. In other words, integration, assimilation. Speak the language of your country. Forget about Hebrew, which the Haskala promoted. The Haskala promoted the use of Hebrew language or Yiddish language, right, later on. So he says, I'm not writing for the Maskilim either. So again, the religious Jews aren't interested in Haskala. The Maskilim aren't interested in Haskala anymore because they want to integrate and assimilate. And then he says, oh, what about the future generation? Ubanenu, hador haba acharenu. Am I writing for the next generation? He says, nah, they don't care about this at all. They just want to get integrate into the surrounding society and to integrate and to just become, they're not interested in Hebrew culture. They're not interested in Jewish culture. They just want to secularize and integrate and assimilate. And then at the end, he closes this and he says, I don't know the future, but imloha acharon b'meshorerei Tzion hineni. I don't know if I'm one of the last poets of Zion, in other words, Hebrew poets, imlo gamatem hakorim ha'achronim. And maybe you who are reading this are the last readers. So I don't know if you would imagine that Jewish History Soundbites would still be reading it but live on the podcast. But in any event, that I think brings it out more. I think enough said on that. These people, they themselves recognized how little influence they had, and that they're quite unsuccessful in their movements that they're doing. But I want to make a few points which will bring out the wider argument over here. The Haskala, and to a lesser extent other internal Jewish movements, are purely kept alive today and given much more credit and much larger proportions of their legacy than they deserve, purely by the religious community today in the 20th and 21st centuries, because the religious community keeps the Haskala alive. and keeps their large shadow looming over history. I remember a story that I was in school, and I was presenting an essay, a paper that I was working on about how there's certain famous maskilim that, like Mendeleev, for instance, who I mentioned before, who also wrote Sfarim. And those Sfarim are accepted in the yeshiva world, in the Musar movement, in the yeshiva world. And now when people discover that these people were maskilim, so that's a problem. So that's the solution to that problem, at least in places like Bnei Brak and other places, are to revise history, are to say, no, they weren't really maskilim. They were really big tzaddikim, and they were not maskilim at all. So I was presenting on that topic, and the secular professor who was listening to my presentation, he said to me, so in essence, I mean, these people would have been completely forgotten. They were a blip on the screen of history in the 19th century, and no one even remembered them today. But the religious community is keeping them alive. This person was a maskil. He wasn't a maskil. The Haskala had a huge influence. They didn't have a huge influence. So that's the reason that the Haskala is even mentioned, is even known, is even remembered today, is because the religious community is so desperate to keep them alive, to keep them as the enemy of the modern era. The second point I want to make is from that whole long list before, pretty much the only successful endeavor, the only successful movement is the secular state of Israel, because they were able to create a secular Jewish identity without assimilation and intermarriage, right? No one else was successful at stopping assimilation and stopping intermarriage. So the secular state of Israel it was. I remember I was on a trip and I was making this point in like dinner conversation. It wasn't part of the guiding on the trip in Europe, obviously. And the rabbi of the trip wasn't too happy with my conclusion, because it sounded like I'm saying a good thing about the secular state of Israel, which I wasn't. I was just pointing out a historical reality. And he said, "What do you mean? I live in L.A. My shul is from L.A. and there's lots of secular Israelis in L.A. And they all, when they move to L.A., they all integrate and assimilate, and the next generation intermarries." So I said, "Doesn't that prove my point?" So he said, "No, I'm showing you that even Israelis, given the opportunity, assimilate and intermarry." I said, "Of course they do, because they're not in the secular state of Israel. They left. That's the whole point. If they're in the secular state of Israel, they were 99%, probably 99.5% chance that they're going to marry Jewish, and they're going to have a very strong and proud Jewish identity. They're going to speak a Jewish language. They're going to serve in a Jewish army. They're going to, have a Jewish holiday season, even if they don't exactly observe it halachically. So everything is a very strong Jewish identity. Whereas if they moved to LA, they lost that, and that's exactly the proof to what I'm saying. So that's the point. Now, from that one exception, I think the exception proves the rule, that all other movements throughout the modern era, they weren't very successful. So they tried retaining a Jewish identity, a strong Jewish identity, and ultimately in the long term, maybe, it slowed it down. These movements, the Reform and Bund and Yiddishist and all these things, they probably slowed down assimilation and complete secularization and intermarriage by a generation or two, but ultimately were unsuccessful in stopping it completely. Another example that I want to bring through an anecdote. I was writing an article for Mishpacha magazine a few years ago about a beautiful kahal in Yerushalayim run by a couple of friends of mine in Ramat Eshkol, and I was helping them promote their kahal because it was connected to history. So I was writing an article about it because this kahal is unique in that it explores the Torah of Ashkenaz, of great German rabbis in the sort of the modern era, from the 1500s and on, and through the 1900s, and some of them forgotten, great rabbis, great Sfarim and Paiskim, and they explore it, and it's connected to the history of Ashkenaz. So I wanted to cover it and write would also promote their kahal, which was a wonderful enterprise. So Really a great story which ties history and contemporary life together in a powerful way. Anyways, I'm sitting there with my two friends who run this kahal and discussing the history element of their work there in preparation for the article that I was writing. And the topic of the Würzburger Rav came up, Rabbi Yitzchak Dov Bamberger, who was an ancestor of the Rashi kahal, and he is one of the most important German Orthodox rabbis of the 19th century, along with Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch and Reb Israel Hildesheimer and Reb Marcus Lehman. They were probably the four big German Orthodox rabbis of the 19th century that had such a great impact on Orthodox Jewish life in Germany. Either way, Rabbi Yitzchak Dov Bamberger is known as the Würzburger Rav because he was elected to the Würzburg rabbinate sometime in the 1830s or 40s, I don't recall exactly. Basically, so my friend was claiming that the urban centers of Germany were already German Reform Judaism by the 1830s, and they wanted a Reform rabbinical candidate to be elected. But the rural areas and the small towns of Germany were not. They were still traditional, religious, Orthodox, whichever term you're comfortable with. Now, since the elections of the Würzburg rabbinate included the outlying towns in the district and not only the city of Würzburg itself, so the Orthodox communities in Würzburg and its outlying villages and towns in the district, together they were able to manage to obtain a majority over the Reform, who were primarily based in Würzburg itself. And in Würzburg itself, they were the majority. But since the Orthodox also had the outlying communities, and in the rural countryside towns, Orthodoxy still prevailed in the 1830s and 40s, so therefore the Würzburger Rav was able to get a majority and be elected to his position. This was my friend's claim. My friend wanted to draw a demographic conclusion from that. So this is already a conclusion, his own conclusion, namely that the conventional wisdom that by the fourth decade of the 19th century German Jewry was predominantly Reform Judaism is not true. He wanted to say, no, only in the urban centers, only in the cities in Germany was it predominantly Reform by the 1840s. But in the small towns and on the countryside, it was still predominantly Orthodox, and therefore Orthodoxy was flourishing in Germany in the 1830s and 40s, and Orthodoxy was probably still in the majority in the 1830s and 40s. This was his claim. Pretty sound argument, no? So what was my response? I bet you can guess what my response was if you've been listening to this series thus far. I told him that his entire methodology is flawed. I said it very respectfully, of course. I said, how many Reform were there? There weren't that many Reform. Reform wasn't that big of a movement. There was not many Reform Jews and Reform members. Only Reform Judaism would be opposed to the Orthodox candidate because Reform wanted and preferred their own Reform candidate. Who was the real majority? The silent majority, because they didn't vote in these elections. They presumably did not participate in the elections altogether because they couldn't care less about the rabbinate. Who's that? The secular and the assimilated. The overwhelming majority of German Jewry by the 1830s and 40s is secular and assimilated. They don't vote in the rabbinate. They don't care about Reform. They don't care about Orthodox. They're integrating into the surrounding society. They're not participating in the elections for the rabbinate. To them, the Reform and Orthodox is completely irrelevant. So the overwhelming majority is secular and assimilated. There's a small minority of Reform. There's a small minority of Orthodox. And the Reform and Orthodox are duking it out in the rabbinate. And here, in this instance, the Orthodox won and the Reform lost. But that's irrelevant. The whole point, your whole premise is wrong. You're talking about Reform. Who cares about Reform? It had no influence. The point was secularization. Secularization. My friend, had not even considered the existence of secularization because we're brainwashed by this idea of reform. Non-denominational secular is much larger and, to a certain extent, much more of a trend happening on its own because of external factors, nothing to do with reform or anything else. And, of course, assimilated, they're the absolute majority. They're not affiliated at all. It's very similar in Hungary. All Hungarian Heimish Jews will tell you today how their ancestors in both Oberland, the Chassam Sofer legacy, and in Unterland, the Hungarian Hasidic legacy, how they battled the Neolug. The Neolug is the Hungarian reform. The Neolug were a wealthy majority of Hungarian Jewry, so goes the claim, while the Orthodox were an embattled and defensive minority. That's partially true. The Orthodox were definitely smaller and less influential than the Neolug. But the part that's missing from the equation is that the Neolug were also a minority. The absolute majority of Hungarian Jewry were not Neolug or Orthodox. They were secularized and assimilated, and they would never have even considered a Neolug religious identity. They would never identify as Neolug. They would identify as secular and as assimilated into Hungarian society. So now we have, that's the majority. Now within the minority of Hungarian Jews who still had some sort of religious affiliation, the majority of this minority were Neolug, and a minority of this minority were Orthodox. But the predominant trend was total secularization. And that gives a different perspective on things a bit. I'll give you another example. I don't generally like citing films on this podcast, but I could presume that, maybe I should, I don't know. But since I presume almost everyone saw The Pianist, probably the most famous Holocaust film, so I feel like I can. If you remember from the film The Pianist, Władysław Szpilman, who's the main character, in the opening scenes, he and his family are classic Polish, secular, integrated, almost assimilated Jews. Not that that helped them. The Nazis wanted to kill them anyway. That's the point of the movie. And the story, it's a true story, by the way. So, but the Szpilman family, Władysław Szpilman and his parents and his siblings, they would never consider themselves Bundist, Yiddishist, Zionist. They would never consider themselves Haskala. They would never consider themselves Reform or anything else. That would be way too Jewish for them. Their Jewish identity was tenuous at best, barely existent at worst, and that was the trend of much of Polish Jewry at the time. Polish-speaking, integrating into Polish society, non-denominational in any way. They did not specifically identify with Bund or Zionist. They were secular Polish Jews. That's what they were. And it would have continued to grow had not the Holocaust happened. There's an insight I once bumped into about second-generation U.S. Jewish immigrants to the United States. First-generation immigrants to the United States pre-World War II, even pre-World War I, they settled down mostly in neighborhoods in major urban centers like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other places like that, right? Now, in that environment, they are in Jewish neighborhoods, Lower East Side, Brownsville, Harlem at the time, the Bronx, all these places, and they're very, very Jewish environment, and they're very secular, because that's what immigration did to them. They couldn't observe Shabbos, their kids couldn't go to Jewish schools, right? So, but they're speaking Yiddish, and they're buying the Yiddish paper, and they're in a Jewish environment, but it's a secular Jewish environment. Their kids, post-World War II, moved to suburbia. They moved to Westchester, they moved to New Jersey, they moved to Long Island, and I'd mentioned the suburbs of Philadelphia and Chicago, but I don't know them. I only know the ones in New York. So what did that do to Jewish identity? So you'd think that it disappeared, right? And that's what it did happen to many of them. They now assimilated entirely into American society and eventually intermarried. These kids grew up in Yiddish, secular urban neighborhoods, and they moved to suburbia. Now, many of them, and this we find as a fascinating and even shocking trend, many of them join a conservative or reform temple. Obviously not Orthodox. Now, why do they do that? There's this surge. Now, when they lived in Brownsville, their parents did not join a single shul. They were never members of a synagogue or a temple or an Orthodox shtibel. Many of them. Some of them were, but many of them were not. They were already secular, completely secular. So why do their kids all of a sudden feel the need to join a conservative or reform temple, which is a religious identity? It's not an Orthodox religious identity. It's a conservative or reform religious identity. They voluntarily decide to join a conservative reform, even though they never saw it in their home. In other words, their parents didn't join any shul whatsoever, not Orthodox, not conservative or reform. Never stepped in a shul in their lives, not them or their parents. We know these. This is statistics. Why do they all of a sudden join conservative reform? Because they chose Jewish identity. These kids had grown up in Yiddish-speaking homes in very Jewish neighborhoods like Brownsville, but it was completely secular. So in that environment, They felt Jewish. They felt Jewish enough. They felt their Jewish identity didn't need any support. And now that they moved to the suburbs, and now they feel their Jewish identity ebbing, many of them just let it go, and they assimilated and intermarried. But others chose voluntarily to preserve or attempt to preserve. Whether it was successful or not, we already discussed. Perhaps it wasn't very successful. It only lasted a generation or two, and then their grandkids may have assimilated and intermarried. But this was a choice of Jewish identity, of preserving a Jewish identity. So that's a fascinating view of things. Basically, the modern era came. And since then, there's been this struggle to redefine Jewish identity within the new world called the modern era. Pre-modern era, Jewish identity did not have to be clearly defined. It didn't have to be defined at all. It was automatic. It was the nature of things. And Jewish identity in the pre-modern era was defined by external factors, namely the non-Jewish governments and the church. They defined who was a Jew. And you were in the Jewish kahal, you were in the Jewish community, whether you were strictly observant of every precept of the Shulchan Aruch or not. The modern era comes along with emancipation and all that, and now Jews have to voluntarily decide who they are and how they will be and how they will define their Jewish identity. So let's talk about the two extremes before returning to the middle. On one end of the spectrum, we have the secularists or the assimilationists. That's the eventual negation of Jewish identity. Since Jewish identity was a product of church and non-Jewish discrimination in the pre-modern era, so these Jews figured, well, then Jewish identity has no place in the modern emancipated world. So they're on this trajectory for a negation of Jewish identity entirely. That's called assimilation. On the other end of the spectrum is orthodoxy. Orthodoxy as a modern movement means that it's not because the kahal forces you. It's not because the church forces you. It's not because the non-Jewish government forces you. It's by choice. I choose to identify as Orthodox, as religiously observant. We take the modern era and we react to the modern era by making a conscious decision to observe Orthodoxy and embrace tradition and not secularism or anything else. That's the two extremes. What do we have in between? We have all these internal Jewish movements. We have everything else in between. Everything else in between, all these other movements say, we don't want assimilation. This emancipation has brought us this idea that we can now integrate into society and assimilate, and there's going to be a negation of Jewish identity. We don't want this total integration. We don't even want total secularization and negation of Jewish identity. We want to figure out a new type of Jewish identity. You know why? Because orthodoxy has no place in the modern world, according to these other movements. It's an emancipated world, so we need to create a new Jewish identity for the modern world to preserve Jewish identity in the modern world. And that is Reform and Neolog. They say, and similar movements, they say religion is still the basis of Jewish identity, but religion must conform to the changing times. So they were fundamentally against secularization, and for sure assimilation. But these movements felt that in order to survive and continue to serve as the basis of Jewish identity, then religious observance must adapt to the times. The moderate Haskala and other similar movements claim that religion doesn't have to change at all. You can still be a fully observant Jew. But Jews should integrate more into their surroundings. They should adapt certain trappings of the surrounding culture in the modern era in order to prove worthy of emancipation. And also, naively, they thought it would put an end to anti-Semitism. Radical Haskala wanted to change certain aspects of religion too, and then the various strains of Jewish nationalism that came a generation later claimed that Jews are not a religion in the modern era. They are a nation. This is perhaps the most Jewish movement ever, because basically Jewish nationalism is a complete rejection of emancipation. They're saying, thousands of years we waited for emancipation. We don't want it. We don't want emancipation. We're not Russian. We're not French. We're not German. We don't want emancipation. We're Jewish. We're Jewish without religion. That's what Jewish nationalism said. But we're a Jewish nation. Either our history, our culture, our language, our autonomy, like Shimon Duva, like I said, with the Volksparty style, or Yiddish socialism like the Bund, or, most famously, the various forms of Zionism. Which was saying that Jews are a nation. It's a rejection of emancipation. Now, on one hand, many of these movements were completely secular, devoid of any religious observance, and to a certain extent even atheistic. That's true. But they were more a product of the wave of secularization and were responding to secularization by saying to the Jewish 19th century, you can become secular, which is happening anyway, but retain a Jewish identity. Don't assimilate. They were inherently an anti-assimilationist. And more importantly, they weren't generating the wave of secularization. They were riding on the existing wave of secularization, which was happening because of the external factors of the modern era. And they were trying to create a Jewish identity out of this wave of secularization. Now, many will claim that Zionism and other forms of nationalism were born out of the Haskala, which ended around the 1880s. The Haskala movement ended in the 1880s. And coincidentally, Zionism and other forms of Jewish nationalism begin in the 1880s. So they're seen as the next, there's Haskala and it leads into Jewish nationalism and Zionism. That they're basically a product in the next generation of the Haskala. But guess what? That's not true either. Jewish nationalism in general and Zionism in its various forms in particular were born out of, again, two external factors of the European Jewish experience of the 19th century. It is largely external factors. Number one, a rising nationalism all over Europe, which rubs off on the Jews as well. Nationalism is a new political idea and a new political system in Europe in the 19th century, so it rubs off on Jews too. So there's Jewish nationalism. And number two, the disappointment of emancipation. This was two different disappointments. In Western Europe, the disappointment was that emancipation, which was achieved in Western Europe from the French Revolution and on, so emancipation was supposed to do away with anti-Semitism. And shockingly, it didn't. So the Western European Jews were very disappointed with emancipation. In Eastern Europe, meaning in Tsarist Russia, emancipation seemed further out of reach than ever. It seemed that it would never come. The Romanov Tsarist government was not willing to give emancipation, so they were disappointed. So emancipation wasn't happening. What was the solution? Leon Pinsker said in his famous pamphlet, auto-emancipation. In other words, Jewish nationalism, which would evolve into the Zionist movement. The Jews should emancipate themselves. Since emancipation didn't work, the Jews should create the Jewish nation and the Jewish country. So again, that's two external factors. It's not because the Haskala ran out of steam, so now we're going to create a new movement out of the Haskala called Jewish nationalism. It's again external factors. External factors. I want to illustrate this point with a story from interwar Poland. I know I'm going over time, but this is the last one of the series, and I'm not planning on doing a fifth installment, so I want to finish with this. I want to illustrate this point with a story from interwar Poland, one of the big polemics at the time, and we even still hear echoes in the religious world railing against this from time to time till today, was the Zionist Tarbut schools. The Zionist movement had a whole system of schools across Poland and other parts of Europe called Tarbut. And as if these schools were the ones, and the claim is that these schools caused secularization and these schools took kids out of the cheder, and as if they were one of the big educational challenges to religious life in interwar Poland. That's laughable. And all one needs to do is look at the numbers, which we have, to realize how silly this claim is. Tarbut was a tiny school system which had almost zero impact on Polish Jewry. Do you know why? Because Tarbut charged tuition. Most Polish Jews were poor. They wouldn't dream of sending their kids to a Tarbut school. Who went to Tarbut schools? A few upper middle class kids. You know which schools did not charge tuition that you don't hear much polemics about? Polish public schools. And that's where the overwhelming majority of Jewish kids, including from religious homes, went during the interwar period. You know why they went there? Because it was free. It was the Polish public schools. And you know what happened when kids went to Polish public schools? That leads to secularization and assimilation. Had they been there long enough, instead most ended up in Treblinka gas chambers and other places, unfortunately. The Holocaust happened a few years later. But the Tarbut schools aren't to blame. No one even went there. What's the big deal about it? Who cares about a few Tarbut schools? The Polish public schools, where the overwhelming majority of Polish Jewish kids went. And in Polish public schools, with Polish language and culture and Polish nationalism, That's integration, that's assimilation, that's secularization. That's where it happens. But that all, for some reason, which is the external factor, correct? Compulsory education laws, the rise of the Second Polish Republic, right? That's external. That's what I'm claiming all along. But instead we focus on the few Tarbut schools who charged tuition and no one could go there anyway. Tarbut schools are very similar to public schools in the modern state of Israel. They provided a strong, albeit secular, Jewish identity, Jewish language, Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish connection to their historic Jewish homeland. So they had a strong Jewish identity. That's not assimilation. While the majority of Jewish students in Poland were attending public school, which would be today's equivalent of diaspora secular kids in public school, in contrast to Israeli kids who have a much stronger Jewish connection, even though it's not religious. So, just to finish off, last points in this series. History is cyclical. Actions beget reactions. And therefore, there are cycles of history. And there's a cycle of secularization. There's reactions within the Jewish world. Some are non-orthodox, some are orthodox. The orthodox is responding. There's a reaction. There's a strengthening of religion on one hand and a weakening on the other hand. Number two, the modern era and the struggle against internal Jewish movements generated orthodoxy, which in its many forms and expressions, and we barely touched on it, we could talk about the many forms of orthodoxy across Europe, was one of the greatest spiritualist, revivalist movements in Jewish history. So ultimately, at least for the Orthodox minority, things turned out okay for orthodoxy in the modern era. And number three, the fact that these internal movements turned up gave orthodoxy something to fight for. Fighting for something in turn provided meaning for them and revitalized them as well, meaning orthodoxy. So ultimately, the fight itself is what saved and to a certain extent created orthodoxy. So that's the end of secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era due to external factors and the Orthodox response and the internal Jewish movements. I want to thank you all for this really wonderful series. I had a lot of fun preparing it and delivering it. I had even more fun dealing with your answering and receiving and hearing your feedback and ideas and insights, even when they disagreed. If you liked it and if you continue to like Jewish History Soundbite, so keep on listening to the podcast, encourage others, drop a rating and review. We have lots more content. Now that we finish this series, we're going to go back to regular installments, hopefully on a weekly basis. Many future episodes. There's a lot more great things coming on Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Gerber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudagerber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.